Welcome class to your mini lecture on Chapter 4. Chapter 4 actually covers 3 different categories of disorders. They used to be lumped together as one category, anxiety disorders, but the new DSM-5 actually has separated them, and now there's different chapters, so I'm actually going to be covering 3 different categories here. Ideally, I wish the book would separate them as well, but textbooks don't always do what you want them to do. So we're going to be talking about anxiety disorders, and there's going to be 5 main disorders that we'll talk about, and 2 additional disorders that are only found in children. Then we're going to be talking about obsessive-related disorders, and then trauma-related disorders. The trauma-related disorders, the book really only talks about one disorder, but I want to make sure you know about at least one additional one that I think is important. You can't really understand one without understanding the other. So let's start with the anxiety disorders. I also want to mention the textbook does a really nice job of separating this idea of anxiety and fear that everybody gets with this idea of what is clinically significant in terms of anxiety and fear. And also, what is the difference between anxiety versus fear? So make sure you're looking at some of that background information so you really get a good foundation about what lumps these disorders together and why we treat them together. So let's start with the very first anxiety disorder, which is generalized anxiety disorder. It's a fairly common disorder. About 9 to 10% of the population will have it at some point in time. The idea behind generalized anxiety disorder is that the person worries. They worry a lot, and they worry about a couple of different things. It's not just one thing. So it's not that you just worry about school, but you worry about school, and you worry about your parents, or you worry about your finances, or you worry about your relationships, and it's really excessive. So it's not rational worry like, ooh, I haven't done so well on exams, so I'm worried about my grade. That's normal. You should be. But it's excessive worry at times when you shouldn't be worrying. And again, remember what I talked about in the first mini lecture. When we look at diagnosis, we look at things like time, we look at symptom, and we look at dysfunction. So the time for generalized anxiety disorder is 6 months. So it's not just that you are kind of having a worry time for a while, but for a period of 6 months, you have these chronic, persistent worries that never really go away no matter what you do. So that's generalized anxiety disorder. Panic disorder is all about having panic attacks. And I want to separate those 2 things. There's panic attacks, and then there's actual clinical panic disorder. So a panic attack, about 1/3 of the population will have. So keep that in mind. Panic attacks are actually fairly common. So 1/3 of the population at some point in time in their life will experience what's called a panic attack. And your book does a nice job of telling you all the criteria. I think there's like 13 or 14 different criteria, mostly physical. You feel like something's laying on you, your chest gets really heavy, your heart starts pounding, you start sweating, all sorts of physical reactions basically to anxiety, and you can't control them. So having a panic attack is normal, but panic disorder is when you have reoccurring attacks, so you have more than one, and this is key, at least 1 month after a panic attack, you have changed your life because you're worried about having another panic attack. That's really the key to panic disorder. You're worried that, oh my God, I'm going to have another panic attack, and then I'm not going to be able to get help, or I'm going to be embarrassed about it, or I'm not going to be safe. So maybe you don't go to class anymore, or you don't drive anymore because you're worried you'll have a panic attack while you're driving and cause an accident. So you have changed your life because you're worried you're going to have more panic attacks. So that's the difference between a panic attack versus a panic disorder. Make sure that that makes sense to you. The third one is a new disorder. It used to be lumped together with panic disorder, but we now understand it as its own disorder. It's called agoraphobia. You guys have actually heard of agoraphobia before, I'm sure. Literally, it translates into a fear of open spaces. Oftentimes we think about people with agoraphobia as people who are afraid to leave their house. And certainly that is part of the case. But other people might have different symptoms. Basically, it's a fear of being in a public space or a crowded space or an open space of some kind. It has to be at least two different situations, 2 different places that you fear, and you do what you can to avoid them, or you only go to those places with extreme anxiety. So again, it could be fear of being in crowds. A lot of people have a fear of being in crowds, but the fear is so strong that you never go anywhere if you think there's going to be a crowd. And think about in your lifetime the amount of times that you're in crowds. That really would limit you. It could be that you're afraid of public transportation. So it might not be an issue most of the time, but you would not be willing to go on a bus or a train or a plane even, because, again, a lot of it traces back to panic attacks. You're afraid you're going to have a panic attack and you won't be able to receive help. So make sure you look at agoraphobia, make sure you look at what those situations are and what those specific behaviors. That's one where there's specific behaviors that a person has to do in order to be classified with agoraphobia. And again, the most extreme cases, people don't leave their house anymore. There are what we call specific phobias. So this is separate from agoraphobia and separate from, we'll talk about social anxiety disorder in a moment. And so this is where it's a marked fear. So it's not just I'm kind of afraid, but it's what we call marked. We used to say that it had to be irrational. We took out the term irrational in the new DSM, and now we replaced it with this idea of a marked fear. So an extreme fear, a severe fear. And because this fear is so strong, you actually have avoidance behaviors where you're trying to avoid the thing that you fear, and or your reaction to it is so strong that you have other issues. So this isn't somebody who's like, oh, I'm afraid of snakes, and so when I see one in the yard, I jump, and then I go about my day. Like, you would avoid going into grassy yards because there might be a snake there. That would be more of a phobia. So it's much more extreme. It actually disrupts your life in some way, shape, or form. So you could have a fear of pythons, and living in Iowa, that doesn't actually disrupt your life much because you're not avoiding anything. You're not likely to run across a python just hanging out at Riverside Park. So that would not be considered a specific phobia. It doesn't disrupt your life. It has to disrupt your life in some way. So there's different kinds of specific phobias. Make sure you check those out. There's animal phobias, natural environment ones, situation ones like flying. There's one called blood injection injury, which are very specific ones where you when you see blood, you faint. That would be a specific phobia, that sort of thing. And then there's a miscellaneous category, other category. Social anxiety disorder. This used to be classified as a specific phobia. It's now been taken out and now it's its own disorder. And basically, you are afraid of judgments and criticism. And that's the root of that phobia. So because you're afraid of other people's judgments and criticisms of you, then you actually avoid social situations or you deal with them with extreme anxiety. So it could be about public speaking. If you have public speaking fear and you meet the other criteria, you could have social anxiety. It could be about meeting new people. It could be maybe you have extreme anxiety, and so whenever a new class starts, that's the thing that provokes that anxiety. So you don't venture out beyond your tight-knit group of people because you're afraid other people are judging or criticizing you. So again, look at the specific criteria for that, but that's what social anxiety disorder is all about. Those are our 5 big anxiety disorders. Again, with children, there's 2 of them I want to briefly mention, enough to where I want you to make sure you know them, but they're not going to be a major focus. Selective mutism is basically almost like social anxiety disorder, but for children. So children are able to speak. They talk to their parents, they talk to their caregivers, but they don't speak in public situations. So they don't speak at school, or they don't speak when they're out on the town with their parents, for whatever reason. It's very, very rare. Less than 1% of children have it, but it's a very specific sort of social phobia in a sense. Separation anxiety disorder. All children go through separation anxiety. However, if it is beyond the developmental age of when normal separation anxiety occurs, then it can become a disorder. And so again, look at the criteria for that. It's very specific criteria in terms of what the behavior of the child is and when they're afraid and when they don't want to be separated. So those are the 2 childhood ones. We'll move on to the obsessive-related disorders. Of course, the big one that everybody thinks about is OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorder. And I want to make sure that I clarify what this is. So obsessive, those are thoughts. So in order to have OCD, you have to have these reoccurring, unpleasant, unwarranted, unwanted thoughts that come up in your head. So you don't enjoy thinking about these things. They pop in your head, and no matter what you do, you can't get rid of them. So common ones that we often think about are things like germs. So you're constantly thinking about the fact that there's germs all around you, and they're just, everything has germs on it. How do I avoid these germs? You don't want to think about germs, but you can't help it. They just keep cropping up in your head. Other common thoughts tend to be things like sexual or aggressive impulses. So sometimes people are thinking about things like killing their mom, and they love their mom. There's no aggression towards their mom. There's no deep-seated psychological issue there, but they just keep thinking about their mom dying, and they can't get that thought out of their head. So those are obsessions. Compulsions, on the other hand, are behaviors. And these are very specific behaviors that you do in order to get rid of the thoughts. So it's all about decreasing the anxiety. So, for example, all I do is I'm thinking about germs. So the only way I can reduce my anxiety about germs is if I wash my hands 3 times. Then there's no real rational reason why 3 times would actually get rid of all the germs as opposed to 4 or 2. But for you, the only way you're going to reduce your anxiety and calm down is if you wash 3 times. And then you feel better until the next time that obsession comes in, and then you have the compulsion again. So that's an example of how an obsession and a compulsion works together. Thinking about germs, I've washed my hand 3 times, and 3 tends to be a magical number for people. We don't know why. A lot of people with OCD do things in 3s. I've washed them 3 times and now I'm done. Now I feel better. Sometimes there's no real connection between them. So there's a nursery rhyme that some people know. Don't step on a crack or you'll fall and break your mom's back. That could actually be flipped around, and that could be an OCD thing. So maybe you're thinking about your mom getting hurt, your mom's back breaking, and the only way that you can reduce that anxiety is if you make sure that you don't step on cracks. So you're sort of avoiding any cracks in the sidewalk. There is no rational connection between them, but it reduces your anxiety, therefore it qualifies as OCD. The key thing about OCD is they are unwanted, unpleasant. You don't want to do these behaviors. You don't want to avoid cracks. You don't want to wash your hands 3 times. You don't want to check to make sure the oven is turned off 3 times. These are behaviors you feel compelled to do because it's the only way it's going to reduce your anxiety. So these are not things like when they talk about people having like a sexual compulsion or something. I just have to have sex all the time. Sex is a pleasant thing, an enjoyable thing. So it's not classified with OCD, it's classified actually with the substance abuse disorders. Alright, so that's OCD. Body dysmorphic disorder is where you have a specific obsession with a part of your body that's not your weight. So if it has to do with weight or being thin or something like that, then it goes into the eating disorder category. But let's say you're obsessed with your nose, and you just think your nose is the weirdest looking thing, maybe it's too long, maybe it's crooked, I don't know, but you are obsessed with how your nose looks. And so you spend a lot of time maybe putting on makeup to try to avoid certain areas of your nose, or maybe you spend a lot of time looking in the mirror at your nose, or you spend a lot of time thinking about people thinking about your nose. Whatever you're doing, you're spending a lot of time obsessed with one area of your body. So that's body dysmorphic disorder. In really extreme cases, we see people that have sort of extreme surgeries to try to take care of things. Michael Jackson would be a really great example of somebody who probably had body dysmorphic disorder simply because he kept having these different plastic surgeries to try to fix a part of his body that he just never thought looked right. And we can look at the history of Michael Jackson because it was after an accident that he had, a fire that he had, etc., etc. But the etiology is not as important as the fact that he probably met the criteria in terms of the symptoms. So that's body dysmorphic disorder. Hoarding disorder is a new disorder to the DSM-5. It used to be classified under OCD, so there were some people with OCD who could have hoarding or not. Now it's its own separate disorder. And hoarding disorder, there's 4 different criteria, but really the key to it is that people don't throw things away because throwing them away would cause them extreme distress. It's very distressful for them to throw things away. And so they collect things. They tend to just sort of collect either certain objects. It could be about 1/3 of people are what we call animal hoarders. So those are people who have 50 cats in a house, which is way too many cats. I like cats, but that's too many cats. And they collect. And because they're distressed about throwing them away, they never get rid of them. And so it actually impairs their living situation. That's a key factor. Areas of their house are taken over with this clutter to the point where they're not functional anymore. So they sleep on the couch instead of their bed because their bed is covered in whatever it is that they're hoarding. There's a video that I posted on the Moodle site that I really want everybody to watch. I usually show it in class. It's a really great example of sort of how hoarding affects a person in various ways, the physical health, the safety of the person, but also the family. Hoarding can be just a really sad disorder, and it can go on for a very long time. So hoarding disorder is a new one to understand. If you've ever watched Hoarders, they actually do a pretty good job of not dramatizing situations, but really showing how hoarding behaviors can really be damaging. And most people will need to get psychological treatment in order to get better. It's not just about going in and cleaning up a place. Like there's other stuff there too. So those are the obsessive related disorders. There's 3 of them. The final one is trauma related. This is actually the only category where the etiology is part of the diagnosis. What I mean by that is the cause of the mental illness, what has caused the mental illness, is actually part of the diagnosis. So number 1, we're talking about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. In order to have it, you have to have had something happen in which you believed that you were going to either be violence against you, sexual violence against you, or that you would die. So that has to either have been possible in that situation or had to be threatened in that situation in order for you to have PTSD. So you can't have PTSD over something that doesn't involve a threat or possibility of being injured or being violated sexually or of dying. So that's really a key component. And not everybody who's in those situations necessarily would qualify as having PTSD. So only a small percentage of people who are in those situations will have PTSD. But etiology, the cause of it, is actually part of the diagnosis. The other big thing I want you to think about when you think about PTSD is timeline. Time becomes really important. It has to be basically over 31 days after the incident. So if something happened where you almost died and the next day you are experiencing all these PTSD symptoms, and there's tons of them, so make sure you look at those criteria: intrusive thoughts, nightmares, flashbacks, cognitive difficulties, mood difficulties. It's the next day and you're experiencing those, we call that normal. You were just in something that was life-threatening. So yeah, you're going to be shook up and you're going to have these symptoms. That's normal. But if it's over a month, or over those 31 days, and you're still experiencing X amount of symptoms, so it's about frequency, how many symptoms you have, in a severe way, and at this point they should have decreased enough to where you're not experiencing this many symptoms, then you probably have PTSD. So it can only be diagnosed a month after the incident happened. Now, what your book doesn't talk about is acute stress disorder, and I do think it's important, because acute stress disorder, I think it does talk about it maybe in a small area, but I want to make sure I emphasize it. That can be diagnosed between 3 and 31 days after the event. So what's sad is sometimes an event happens and there's a big possibility that you're going to experience PTSD, but I can't diagnose you for another month. So what do? Do I just not give you treatment? Do I just send you off and say come back in a month? If it's at least 3 days after the event, I can say you're experiencing acute stress disorder, which is basically PTSD, but it's very, very quickly. So right away I'm seeing signs where you could be predisposed to having PTSD. So I'm going to start treating you, and I'm going to treat you with acute stress disorder. And if I can help you get rid of those symptoms within that first month, then you never go to PTSD, and that's fantastic and that's fabulous. But if I can't, and it's after a month, you no longer have the acute stress disorder, now you have the full-blown PTSD. So that's how we deal with trauma-related stuff. So again, these are the 3 criteria. All 3 of them are in the chapter, so it's a big chapter. That's why I kind of do chapter 4 and chapter 6 by themselves, because chapter 4 is such a big chapter, such a lot of, different diagnosis, that I want to make sure that you're able to digest everything. Again, make sure you look at the etiologies. Big etiologies when it comes to this have to do with cognitive behavioral stuff. A lot of the etiology has to do with avoidance of fear, and so we can connect that with a lot of the treatments, which are really exposure treatments. So whatever you're afraid of, if I can expose you to it and get you to calm down in the presence of it, then I'm actually going to get rid of those disorders. So exposure therapy is great for anxiety disorders. It's been used on the obsessive and the trauma-related stuff in various ways with different success. But when you think about the etiology and the treatments, that's what I really want you to focus on. Okay, I think that's everything for this chapter. Again, if you have questions, make sure you're emailing me, or please post on these discussion forums. It will be benefit for everybody. So good luck on the next exam, and I'll see you in the next mini lecture.